Okay, this is round number 3 of Culture, Mind and Brain seminars. Thank you very much, everyone, for being here. This is my first time doing a meta-performative camera thing, so I'm going to be a little bit awkward. But I wanted to thank again all of you for being here and thank our really phenomenally bright speakers that I'm going to introduce now. So the topic of today's talk is actually a debate, and it's a debate about aboutness, a debate on representation, I guess. So first I'm going to introduce the speakers, and I'll say just a tiny little bit about what I had envisioned for the debate, and then I will give the floor to our two very distinguished speakers. So to my left, we have Maxwell Ramstad, who is a PhD candidate here in philosophy. He specializes in the philosophy of cognitive science, psychiatry and neuroscience. He's done some really interesting work on varieties of naturalism in phenomenology. I first heard about Maxwell a few months back when a feverish, really excited Lawrence Kermeyer. Professor Kermeyer is kind of like my mentor. He's a professor of transcultural psychiatry. It's a department where I'm a visiting professor. Sent along a paper on varieties of naturalism by, and I'm quoting Lawrence here, a really bright, promising young scholar whom we were very fortunate to have here at McGill. So this is Maxwell here. And then I met Maxwell in the flesh just a few weeks ago in a course on cultural psychiatry that I'm co-teaching. And the feeling was sort of like what my former student Thomas Canavan calls mutual recognition, right? I mean, I felt an instant fondness for Maxwell, and I hope that doesn't sound too weird, but I got a really strong sense that he was going to be a fantastic interlocutor and a very great friend as well. So very, very happy to have you here, Maxwell. Now, to my right, we have Eric White, who is a master's candidate in anthropology working under Eduardo Cohn. Eric specializes in linguistic and semiotic anthropology, and he's about to embark on a fieldwork journey in remote corners of the Peruvian Amazon, where he's going to elucidate a number of fascinating questions pertaining to the nature of language and meaning, but also sketching some really interesting correlations between biodiversity on the one hand and linguistic diversity and cosmological diversity. So I've known Eric for much longer. I first met Eric about 11 years ago in an anthropology seminar here at McGill. And I hope that the feeling is mutual when I said that it was, again, one of those instant mutual recognition moments. And I say this absolutely without exaggeration. I mean, I was beginning my doctorate at the time, and Eric was finishing his undergraduate studies. But Eric has been and remains something of an intellectual, artistic, and even, dare I say it, spiritual mentor for me. So I'm very, very, very happy to have Eric here. So Eric's journey since graduating university, he ended up somehow graduating with a literature degree from Northern Michigan State University. It's a little bit unusual and something that I sometimes like to recommend, that kind of journey, to students who are graduating and who are thinking about graduate school. So what Eric did is that he basically disappeared for close to a decade, right? So Eric is, and I'm not quite sure what he did, but he's rumored to have been cited in some places like San Cristobal de las Casas in Chiapas. A few months later, he was cited in the company of a Dutch serial killer in a dive on Khao San Road in Bangkok. Then he was seen again running amok between the Peruvian and Bolivian Altiplano in a sort of a borderless zone. Then he was seen again in some dubious Paraguayan clubs in Buenos Aires, and then he ended up on an island at the mouth of the Amazon that may or may not exist, right? And then Eric gave us a spectacular return, and he is, I guarantee, much like Maxwell, on his way to becoming a very, very distinguished scholar. Both of you, I think. So again, thank you so much for being here. So this is it for the introduction. Now, the topic, I think both speakers are much more competent than I am to speak about representations, but where I'm approaching the subject is basically with a lot of questions. I don't really know what representation is. And it seems to me that in a variety of intellectual disciplines of late, some that sort of dabble in phenomenology, but even people who call themselves Spinozas before that, it's become very fashionable to be against representation. Right? So some people, like in anthropology, Tim Ingold, or in philosophy, Alvanoe, for example, go as far as claiming that there are no such things as representation. There's only immersive experience. There are only varieties of presence. Right? So representations don't get passed on from generation to generation. There are only skills that get regrown. Okay. But again, what's a representation, right? So if we look briefly at the other camp, which is often called by its opponents the mentalist, there is still a very dominant trope about representation that goes something like this. And here I'm going to quote the very eminent paleoanthropologist Ian Tattersall. So he says, there's something uniquely, even disturbingly distinctive in the way in which we modern Homo sapiens perceive the world around us and interact with it. For rather than simply responding to stimuli we receive from outside, we recreate the world in our minds in order to explain it to ourselves. So I take it that this is a trope that our phenomenologist friends take issues with. And I'm sometimes not quite sure why. So Tattersall here, he's not just talking about sort of mere visual representations of the world in the visual cortex. He's talking about the worlds of concepts, of categories, of meaning, right? Of ideas, of ideologies even, that we humans seem to live in. By some account, that we exclusively live in. So for the cognitive anthropologist Dan Sperber, who gave us a very, very contested theory of the epidemiology of representations, there are basically two kinds of representations, right? So there are some which he calls public, and I would call them semantic. And those basically depend on convention. So for example, that we all recognize the space in which we stand now as a classroom. We're drawing upon this public classroom representation. Now that, maybe 5 years ago, in this very classroom, I embarrassed myself spectacularly, and I have a memory of it. Well, this is a private representation of mine that may be loosely, fuzzily shared with the 5 or 6 people who might have been around the room and who have their own private memory of that event, but that's not going to get passed on, it's not going to become part of public culture. So Sperber presents the problem this way, and of course people, as we will see, take issues with his speaking of there being representations to begin with. But again, what are they? But where are they? So are representations in the brain? Are they in the body? Or are they, like it's become really fashionable to speak of, they're embodied, they're embedded, they're enacted, they extend to the world around us? Sure, but what do we mean by that? So now the final question that I will raise is one of epistemology and ontology. So if I adopt a strategic naturalist stance on the question, it seems that I'm asking an epistemological question. So is it the case that humans form or have representations? That's an epistemological question. But now if I stretch that naturalist stance and I have somehow decided that humans do have and form representations, then representations are a thing of the world as well. And then it becomes an ontological question. Right? So I'm very interested in what both of our speakers have to say about it because, and I may be wrong on this, about this, but if I understand correctly, I think, Maxwell, you're some sort of a recovering an activist, you're struggling with phenomenology, and you might be on your way to becoming a naturalist. So in the way I would think about it for Eric, so Eric is a recovering emergentist maybe, struggling with multi-naturalism, and who is coming out as a really, really hard American-style pragmatist. Right? Now, I for one, and I'm just going to go on record as saying this now, even though I may change my mind about this, I'm not a monist. That this is something that I want to say. And I think I'm either an ontological agnostic, maybe an ontological pluralist, and when it comes to small human affairs, I'm simply a dynamic nominalist. So I've spoken enough. I'm very, very happy and excited to give the floor to our first speaker, Maxwell Ramstead. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for that great introduction.